Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me as always is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, welcome.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
We are continuing our journey into the S&I mempool crash course, and last week we did the problem with altcoins, which was sort of the first article that we had on actually the Mises Circle. It was prior to the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, but it was the first one talking about altcoins and why we think they are ridiculous. And we are talking about effectively the next one that came out, also by Daniel, called The Coming Demise of the Altcoins and What You Can Do to Hasten It. So this article came out on March 14th, 2014. The price was about $628.31. We showed a chart last time of the coin market cap at the time of writing, and I don't have that up today, but it's basically a whole bunch of other coins. There are a few shared ones, like Litecoin and such, but then there are other completely forgettable coins like Aurora Coin. Aurora Coin was the idea that we were going to airdrop a bunch of coins to everyone was it Iceland or Norway? I think it was Iceland.
Yeah.
And somehow that was going to magically, because everyone was getting some coins, that was just going to bootstrap an entire new global financial economy. And that came to pass. We now live in a hyper Aurora coinized world. And now we're talking about the history of that. But actually, no. So it completely failed, just like a lot of the other ones on that list. As we said, Litecoin still struggles on, and so on. And so yeah, we're going to get into this. I think this article, I think there's going to be a lot to say about looking back on how we viewed altcoins and what we got right, what we were a little too optimistic about, with people learning from mistakes and learning that some ideas are bad ideas, and then also just underestimating the way that things would develop, such that I think markets continued on in a way that we didn't necessarily totally expect. And so Bitcoin remains king, but not quite in the same way as it was in 2014. Not in the sense that I see it as any risk of Bitcoin not being king, but just in terms of what the competitive landscape looks like on both a technological and a social in those manners. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into this. Now, this starts off with a picture of the man standing over a sea of fog, and it starts with a Nietzsche quote. "O my brethren, am I then cruel? But I say, what falleth, that shall one also push. Everything of today, it falleth, it decayeth. Who would preserve it? But I wish also to push it. Know ye the delight which rolleth stones into precipitous depths? Those men of today, see just how they roll into my depths. A prelude am I to better players, O my brethren. An example, do according to mine example. And him whom ye do not teach to fly, teach, I pray you, to fall faster." And this, I think, sort of captures some of the feelings of the time, of feeling like altcoins were a complete nuisance, and we had this feeling like they would be going away. And so the quicker that we could get rid of them, the better. So starting off, introduction. I understand the word altcoin to mean a network which competes with Bitcoin's function as a currency and which is smaller than Bitcoin's network. Thus, Litecoin is an altcoin, whereas Bitmessage is not, even though it is inspired by Bitcoin technology. The Ripple system is not an altcoin, although there is an altcoin called Ripple's XRP, which is inexorably linked to it. Ripple's, the currency, should still be considered an altcoin, even though its underlying technology is quite different from Bitcoin. This article explains why there is a tendency towards a single dominant currency, why the network effect overwhelmingly favors Bitcoin above any of its competitors, and why people should speak out against altcoins rather than allow more people to get fooled by them. And I think this is basically a reasonable definition of altcoins. I don't know if you have any quibbles.
No, I think that definition makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's still, more vulgar phrases can help us with our discontent with the currencies that are larger than Bitcoin's network. But this is specifically talking about those on the other side of the competitive curve. So the uses of a currency. There are two things you can do with a currency: save it or spend it. Although in the future, I expect that most people will become both savers and spenders of Bitcoins, it is possible to separate these two uses conceptually. It is possible for people to save with a currency even if there is nothing to buy with it, but it is impossible to spend a currency, that is, use it as a medium of exchange, unless there is someone who wants to save it. If everyone who acquired Bitcoins did so simply to spend them literally immediately, then it would be impossible for them to have any value because anyone who held them for any period of time at all would be willing to get rid of them at any price, including zero. Once the currency develops a little bit of demand, then it can be used as a medium of exchange by paying to those who demand it in exchange for a good or service, or indirectly by paying it to a merchant who immediately resells it for money. The market cap of a currency should be seen as roughly proportional, all things being equal, to a currency's liquidity, which refers to the value which can be bought or sold without significantly altering the price. While it is theoretically possible for a currency of a given market cap to support any volume of trade as a medium of exchange, this requires that people become less and less willing to hold the currency for any length of time as the volume of trade increases. In this situation, severe practical difficulties ultimately develop. For example, if someone wanted to buy something worth more than the entire market cap of the currency he was using, he would have to pay with several transactions. Any disruption in the balance of buyers and sellers would affect a currency's market price more drastically if its market cap was small than if it was large. So the currency with the smaller market cap would be less liquid than the other. And in a footnote, although in an earlier article I satirized people's fear of volatility, which we will get to that article later in the series, clearly if Bitcoin's price could change drastically as a result of everyday purchases or over 10-minute spans, then it could not be used to make payments. The difference here is that between volatility and liquidity. A currency is liquid if one person can spend it without changing the price, whereas it is volatile if everyone is trying to spend or buy it at the same time. If a currency is volatile because many people are investing in it, then that is a good thing because the currency is becoming more liquid. So, with this, I have to do my usual quibble. I think that a medium of exchange, to use a medium of exchange is the acquisition of a good for the purposes of indirect exchange. And when you're spending it, depending on the nature of it, you could say that's sort of fulfilling its use as a medium of exchange. But I think it's a medium of exchange prior to the actual spending of it. But I think this is an important point that if no one wants to hold it, and we've talked about this before, but if no one wants to hold it, then there is no way to actually have any value that you can be trading in the first place. So that sort of makes it useless as a medium of exchange.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That a medium of exchange nowadays, people think of it as like method of payment is kind of, they use those two terms interchangeably, when really I would argue that medium of exchange should be more equivalent to liquidity than, and then store of value is price.
Yes, I can see that point. I think I think this is just so this is just key for this article to understand that need for liquidity, because I think this is basically the basis of his entire argument against altcoins. So I'd like people to keep that in mind. He moves on. The Highlander. A more liquid currency has an advantage over a less liquid one because it can support more trade. Furthermore, liquidity in a currency is self-reinforcing. The more that people buy a currency, the more liquid it becomes. This naturally tends to promote the success of a single currency over all the rest. Consider the hypothetical example of an economy that uses exactly two currencies, A coin and B coin, which are equally preferred by holders. For whatever reason, A coin develops a very slight advantage over B coin. Consequently, a few people exchange B coin for A coin, thus very slightly increasing the market cap and liquidity of A coin and slightly decreasing that of B coin. Now, in addition to its slight advantage over B coin, A coin has the advantage of becoming more liquid. As a result, more people will tend to sell B coin for A coin. Thus, A coin's initial advantage is self-reinforcing, and as the disparity between A coin and B coin increases, its superiority becomes more and more evident. This process will continue as long as B coin still serves as a currency, and may ultimately remain only to serve some extremely marginal purpose, but not as a general medium of exchange. This process should be expected for any two currencies on the free market, ultimately leaving one that is overwhelmingly dominant. Thus, a more liquid currency will tend to be preferable to both savers and spenders. To savers, because of its self-reinforcing superiority, and to spenders, because there is simply more that can be bought with it. And there's a footnote that was added after the fact to clear up a few misconceptions. So I'll go ahead and read that as well. It has been objected to me that people can value an altcoin for reasons other than the size of its network. That possibility does not change the outcome of this discussion at all. All that will do is change the tipping point between them. When people are perfectly indifferent between A coin and B coin, then they are at an unstable equilibrium when they have exactly the same market cap, and whichever one happens to grow slightly at the expense of the other should be expected to win. But let us say, for example, that A coin is perceived to be stodgy and uptight, whereas B coin is fun and youthful, so that people can prefer to hold B coin even if it has a smaller network. That does not change the fact that they both become worse when their networks shrink and better when their networks grow. If A coin and B coin were perfectly balanced, you would expect A coin to have a bigger market cap and B coin to have a smaller one. However, if A coin grew at the expense of B coin, then the network effect benefits A coin at the expense of B coin. At that point, they are no longer in equilibrium, and the network effects benefits A coin at the expense of B coin. And the same thing happens to B coin if it grows slightly at the expense of A coin. There still cannot be two currencies trading side by side in the long run. So I think this is also... The next section gets into the difficulties of just kind of making liquidity happen. So we'll get more into sort of features, but I do think one of the important lessons here is going into the idea that Bitcoin maximalists have developed, which on the monetary maximalism side of things, the idea that the universe tends towards a single currency. And we can find this within much of the Austrian literature, such as Mises and Rothbard alluding to this. There are some discussions you can read in the Theory of Money and Credit, where Mises points out these processes, can take a long time to sort of fully flesh out, because you're always, as you're adding new people that have new technologies, new monetary technologies, et cetera, there's always a chance for upheaval. But just on a sort of ceteris paribus level, because liquidity is the key for allowing the use of a medium of exchange to occur. It sort of, as you said, it sort of is the medium of exchange. It's that liquidity, because it's the liquidity that enables trade to be occurring with that medium of exchange. This is something that like you said, it's self-reinforcing. If you're growing, if people see a medium of exchange and start to hold on to it because they have more positive future expectations of that medium of exchange, it sort of is a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, assuming that there can be entrepreneurial mishaps where you overestimate the quality of the technology and its ability to deliver. But once again, we're talking about it in a sort of ceteris paribus point of view. If you have, Bitcoin and a copy of Bitcoin and one grows, it's literally a better money by virtue of the fact of being more liquid. So if it's more liquid and has more ability to allow for the kinds of trades that a person expects to need to be able to deal with, they're going to be more drawn to that. And that also means that the other one is less useful. So currency competition, this is why, this is called the Highlander, I think there used to be an image, and I think it may have gotten lost in editing at some point, and it's missing all these years, but, it comes from the movie The Highlander, and there's the idea of there can only be one. And it's just, there is, the market itself is not a zero sum, but the competition for money in a way is, just like we've talked about with other goods dealing with network effects. There are these tendencies towards single standards, and money is one of those. So this liquidity competition is very important.
Yeah, and I think that it also, from the cryptocurrency perspective, they don't like to think about this. They like to think about utility. They don't like to think about the liquidity part. And what I've observed is that quite often they cannibalize each other's liquidity and make the situation worse for themselves. There's a tension of, okay, well, you're saying that it's winner take all, and the U.S. dollar, is the current winner and has the most liquidity. So how is that compatible with this view that Bitcoin is going to take market share, right? And I think that, and then extending that to say, oh, but no other currency after that will be able to go from number 2 to number 1. And so I think that's like the biggest debate in the cryptocurrency industry is that concept.
Yes, and I think the liquidity picture kind of helps because we see Bitcoin gaining liquidity against the dollar, but we don't see as much liquidity gains of altcoins against Bitcoin. So I actually took a look just this morning at the CoinMarketCap, listings between what it was at the time of writing and today. And at the time of writing, the number 2 cryptocurrency, which was Litecoin, had about a 5%. The market cap was about 5% the size of Bitcoin. And today, the number 2, Ethereum, it does have about a market cap double that. So it's, about 11%. So in some sense, you could say that like altcoins have grown, but it's not like it's 50%. After all these years and all of these different plays, it has not managed to actually gain serious growth of liquidity. Whereas when you look at Bitcoin versus the dollar, the changes in liquidity is like it went from, a market cap of, I can't do the math in my head right now, but, the market cap in 2014 was quite low, relatively speaking, whereas, on the order of magnitude of maybe a few billion or so. And now, we're looking at, flirting with 2 trillion, and we've crossed that a few times. So the ability for Bitcoin to actually compete against the dollar has been very clear. Obviously, it's still a very small contender in terms of the actual size, but the growth rate is staggering. Whereas, like I said, we just don't see the same with altcoins. And in fact, something like Ethereum, we've had times where we see some growth against it during some hype cycles. But as we see today, it's kind of, it's not, it's just been in sort of free fall. So you just haven't had these sustainable growth. So I don't think that it's like, it's actually a good question to ask, but I don't think that the altcoins hold up in the discussion.
Yeah, and certainly not empirically. The Ethereum, after having kind of a wave of adoption, then it just gets ground down from a liquidity perspective. But I also think that it has to do with that adoption was motivated by the utility. And then when the utility turns out to be ephemeral or non-existent, it doesn't continue, right? And so then you have a currency that, it got bootstrapped into some amount of liquidity, but then that liquidity gets stripped out and either goes to some other hype cycle like Solana and meme coins or something like that, or it accrues to Bitcoin, or it goes back to dollars. Like somebody bought Ethereum, they thought they were going to get rich quick, they didn't, so they sold their Ethereum for dollars.
And you have people who are very excited about stablecoins, which are effectively digital dollars or another form of digital dollars. So almost literally it goes back to dollars in many ways.
I did a chart recently of the market cap of Ethereum versus the market cap of Tethers. I think they're going to cross within the next couple of years, and the Tethers will be number 2. Yeah, exactly.
So I guess the dollar is catching up to Bitcoin.
If I do the same chart of Bitcoin market cap versus Tether's market cap, there's no intersection on the horizon, and it's funny because the Tether truthers will say, "Oh, Bitcoin's backed by Tethers," right? It's like, well, if you look at the data, Bitcoin's a lot bigger than Tethers. So
yeah, I don't see $2 trillion worth of Tethers.
No, not yet. but when you will, you'll have $10 trillion worth of Bitcoin, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, this goes right into the next section. Liquidity cannot be designed. Liquidity, which is required for anything to be used as a currency, cannot be built into a protocol. It does not matter how brilliantly designed an altcoin is and what cool features it has. Its value depends on a factor that is outside its designer's control, something more characteristic of the, quote, spontaneous order of the market than an intrinsic property of the currency. Bitcoin and the dollar have very different properties, so it is possible to explain Bitcoin's success in competition with the dollar despite the network effect of the dollar in light of those different properties. However, cryptocurrencies do not have very different properties from one another, so there is very little basis to predict that an altcoin can successfully compete with Bitcoin. In the case of, for example, as Bitcoin and Litecoin, I see no evidence in reality or in my understanding of human psychology that investors should see the difference in their mining algorithms or confirmation times as remotely important. The factor of roughly 20 by which Bitcoin's market cap outweighs Litecoin's is by far the biggest difference between them. Right now, Bitcoin is growing by supplanting the national currencies, but eventually will absorb the altcoins as well. Bitcoin will gobble up Litecoin at some point, but I do not know if it will be the appetizer or the dessert. A new altcoin cannot survive with only a fraction of the cryptocurrency pie. It must defeat everything else to succeed, including Bitcoin. Since it begins at an extreme disadvantage with respect to Bitcoin, it cannot succeed with technology that is marginally superior to Bitcoin. It must be as significant an advance over Bitcoin as Bitcoin is over the dollar. And I actually think this section could have gone much harder. So in hindsight, part of the reason is that this is being written in early March 2014. So Ethereum barely existed as an idea at the time. And broadly, everything on the market as far as altcoins, it was all just it basically was copies of Bitcoin with one or two parameters changed. And so there really were no significant differences technologically. And what he's saying with the dollar is, obviously Bitcoin has properties that really do affect the way that people would want to choose where they put their money, what they may make what they would speculate on as being important to other actors in the economy. But I think this actually could have talked even more about, just this fact that liquidity cannot be designed in much the way that you were saying, which is and once again, I mean, this sort of came after this article, but the idea that coins are these things for so-called utility rather than liquidity. And so in some sense, some of the altcoins that came on, they took this on. It was like, okay, well then let's make features that are more interesting than Bitcoin. Not just Litecoin. Let's come up with these smart contracting platforms and so on and so forth. But they forgot the liquidity part, and that is something that is dependent on actual savings in the economy. And Bitcoin has been, especially because of the fact that it is good for nothing else other than money, effectively. It has laser-eyed focus on just making something that is worthy of developing a liquidity. It has properties that people would want. It has that focus on developing that liquidity.
Yeah, and you can't make it more scarce than Bitcoin. So, if you say, oh, my coin's going to have, it's going to be 20 million. It's like, okay, but that doesn't change the fact that you were talking about a fixed pie. So there's no way that, I think that answers kind of the earlier question of why is it that Bitcoin can flip in the dollar, but nothing can flip in Bitcoin? Well, it's because the dollar is inflationary. Bitcoin's not. And you can't have something that's more not inflationary than Bitcoin is.
Yes. I mean, we saw the responses to, like stock to flow talk, or it's like, oh, we'll just make it even more, more scarce purely on the basis of the short-term issuance schedule. But that doesn't, as you're pointing out, it doesn't change the long-term scarcity, because both of them go to an issuance of zero, except one of them doesn't actually. So yeah, Bitcoin actually, it came out the gate with a fundamentally different way of approaching money technologically and economically in terms of its policy. And its sort of core feature there, that scarcity that sort of drives the ability for all the other things, no one's offering anything better, because how would you?
Well, and so the way that Ethereum tried, and I've seen others as well, is this idea of like, oh, we're going to destroy currency, and so that way we'll have a decreasing supply. And the problem with that is that whose currency are you destroying? Right there, it's always you're always taking it from someone. And so in the case of Ethereum, they're like, well, we're going to take it from the transaction finality mechanism and say, oh, if you're paying transaction fees, we're going to tax that, and so some percentage of it is going to get destroyed. And that has consequences where essentially you get less transaction finality than you would otherwise have because you've decided to tax it. Not that it really, matters in a proof of stake system where you arguably don't have any transaction finality, but it just shows that if you were to map this onto Bitcoin, it would cause another set of problems.
There was an old Vitalik post on Reddit where he basically said he has no sort of intrinsic problems with the Fed, and it was almost sort of an admiration for the Fed as an institution that does the important job of managing money and such. And I think in some ways, this attitude combined, basically with what you're saying, I think these are connected, is like you don't take the Austrians seriously enough, and you also don't, you fall for more modern definitions of inflation dealing with, things like prices or whatever. And it's sort of, it takes away from like the core thing where, the problem, one of the problems with inflation on the sort of actual like supply side is that you are fundamentally altering the the economic calculation of the people involved, and doing deflation. It doesn't magically necessarily make prices go in a certain way, and you probably don't want to design things that way or try to, like with central planning, but you're really actually causing the same problem. It's just like in a different direction. It's just the one that people don't do as much because it's not as core to our general monetary policies in fiat land. It's very rare that we see the destruction of currency, but it also has destructive effects on the economy. And so when you're opening yourself up to monetary policy in both directions, you're threatening the ability for people to do economic calculation with it, which threatens why people should want to hold it in the first place. And Bitcoin just, it comes in with just the simple solution of just, hey, we're going to have 21 million and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yep.
So moving on, merchants don't matter. The above discussion explains why Vitalik Buterin's objection to my earlier article completely misses the point. He first downplays the network effect for currencies on the basis of switching costs. Quoting Vitalik, making the switch from fiat currency to Bitcoin is quite difficult, and creating bridge services that work between the two is a multi-million-dollar affair involving placating established banking partners and complying with a large body of regulation. The path from one cryptocurrency to another is much simpler. Anyone can set up an anonymous exchange over Tor, and it may even be possible to make trust-free, decentralized exchanges between currencies using Bitcoin's underlying cryptography directly, end quote. He then argues that merchants can easily accept as many cryptocurrencies as they wish. Begin quote, for a merchant accepting Bitcoin, if alternative currencies gather any popularity at all, then switching to Litecoin or Primecoin will be a simple matter of downloading a patch. It is even possible for a merchant to accept every cryptocurrency at the same time, end quote. These arguments entirely misconstrue the nature of the network effect for currencies. Merchants are totally irrelevant, and so is anyone who uses the coins only for the purposes of transferring funds. What matters are the investors, the people who hold the coins long term. For them, there is an enormous difference between the different coins, and switching costs are largely irrelevant. Investors will prefer to hold the coin that has the best prospects, thereby necessarily improving its relative to its competitors. And so, if you're looking at the competition between different currencies and, this is early 2014, so you can, there was already a belief of, Bitcoin possibly going to $10 million. That idea, came out of day one with Hal Finney. So there's even that much more room to grow. And if a very perceptive, entrepreneur is able to believe that's the case, it's like the switching costs, they really are irrelevant. It's a couple percentage points. Obviously, in terms of the absolute amount that you could end up with at the end from switching a few times, it comes at a cost, but the end game is still one where that person is going to end up with a lot of purchasing power. And so that person is not going to care as much about just, the 1% at trading. If anything, that's just going to be, obviously it's like, okay, well, I don't want to trade as much. But the real goal is to not trade much, not because you don't want to bear those costs, it's because you want to find the winning horse and you just want to lock in on that. And so merchants, accepting coins, they can accept whatever, but the people who are spending it, especially early on, are ones who, tend to not care as much about, kind of the actual value of the coins. And they're missing the liquidity argument that we talked about earlier, insofar as trying to tie that to the value of the coins. The fact that they are doing any of those trades is on the basis of the guy who is trying to the guy who is trying to choose the long term, the winning horse. He's the one who's actually allowing these trades to occur in the first place. So, and then, you can accept all of these coins, but you still have to decide, which one am I going to hold on to as a merchant? So if that merchant, also wants to, have a treasury balance, are they going to hold on to all of the prime coin that they just accepted as payment, even if they, they'll accept a ton of prime coin to make up for the difference in liquidity, but are they going to hold on to it? Probably not. Like, if they were smart, they'd be moving to Bitcoin. And so they still have to deal with those switching costs, despite the fact that, for a long-term investor, it might not be as relevant. It's like, even now, when we get to the merchant level, actually, it is. It's like super annoying to have to deal with that. And you'd rather people just give you the most liquid currencies, which is why, you accept Bitcoin, and most, accept dollars, because, it is very easy to get from dollars into both Bitcoin as well as literally anything else you need in the economy.
Yep, well put.
So moving on, analogy to social networks. For currency investors, the network effect is absolute because it is impossible to buy Bitcoins and some altcoin with the same money. This is why analogies to other network effects, such as that between social networks like Facebook and Google Plus, are spurious. It is possible to leverage the benefit of Facebook and Google Plus at the same time. I can, for example, write a single status update and then post it to both social networks at almost no additional cost. Furthermore, there is very little long-term investment in the use of a social network. New status updates lose all value in hours. Message boards come and go. All it takes is to ignore Facebook for a few weeks before there is little to draw one back to it. The network effect for social networks is therefore tiny compared to that of currencies. Intellectually barren. So far, altcoiners have been able to continue creating and mining altcoins without having to justify themselves very clearly. The responses I have heard to my arguments against them have been terribly inadequate. I get either a non sequitur, like script is ASIC resistant, a misunderstanding of the network effect, as with Vitalik's piece, or a vapid, inappropriate skepticism, such as, how can you be absolutely certain that Bitcoin will win? I have never even heard any positive argument for any altcoin that explains why a majority of Bitcoin investors should sell and buy the new coin, or why enough new investors should reject Bitcoin and invest in the new one, in spite of the enormous advantage that Bitcoin already has. And in a footnote, my response to the idea of being absolutely certain is that I cannot be absolutely certain of anything. But if Litecoin were to beat Bitcoin, I would take this as evidence that cryptocurrencies as a class are not a worthwhile investment. If Bitcoin can be defeated by Litecoin, then Litecoin can be defeated by Dogecoin. Why should anyone invest in any cryptocurrency and thereby deign to give it value and liquidity if mere hype and lies can change its fortune? If Litecoin defeats Bitcoin, then I would predict ultimately that no cryptocurrency will win. And I do think that there's truth to that. I think we've spoken about that prior. If in this case, if simply a copy can take over just because, it sort of raises the question of like what was there in the first place. And so it would be hard to expect that it would win over Bitcoin and then win over the global economy, and more show that cryptocurrencies as a whole, like he says, is just not quite ready to be as like not the idea that's going to be able to overtake the global economy. Continuing on, altcoin investment psychology. The present popularity of altcoins should be explained in terms of foolishness and hubris because it cannot be explained rationally. As investors look at a new altcoin that has come out, they might think to themselves, this cryptocurrency is innovative. Perhaps this means it will do well. They might buy in at that point, or they might think a little harder and continue. But wait, Bitcoin has the much larger network and is therefore objectively more useful as a currency than this new altcoin, despite its innovative features. If I decide to buy some, I would have to sell some of my Bitcoins for it, so there is a real opportunity cost. Furthermore, the only way it can win is if all the other investors also switch. Will they or won't they? At the same time, many of the other investors will be thinking the same thing. They will think about the fact that the rest are thinking it too. They will think, no reasonable person would expect this coin to have any but a small chance of success. But since it can only succeed if lots of people really believe in it, this ensures that it cannot be successful, because if no one buys more than a small gamble, then its failure is virtually guaranteed. If they stop thinking there, they will stick with Bitcoin. However, they might also think something along the lines of, it's quite possible that this altcoin will have an extra jolt in price during the next Bitcoin mania because some people may buy it either because they were not intelligent enough to follow the same train of thought as me, or because they too, like me, realize that it may attract people who can be preyed upon. However, that is a risky proposition because it will be hard to know if I am the one preying upon suckers or if I am a sucker myself. They will then either buy it or not, depending on their own confidence and their ability to predict the behavior of foolish people. Thus, altcoin investment ends up as a dynamic interplay between people who have not thought very far ahead and people who think they are taking advantage of other people. I think there's some truth to this, although I also want to point out that I think part of the problem here, and for these early altcoins, it in many ways was, a challenge of being able to get the liquidity off the ground, is this is all going from at least reading this now, it feels like it's coming from a very sort of endogenous place of not looking at the new crop of investors that are coming in who are trying to figure out these same questions and, of which one, what should I be buying? But it's almost looking at, okay, like given the investors that we have, in order for everyone to move over to this altcoin, there's this like shell game going on with all of the other investors. And I think this is where stuff like Ethereum was able to get quite a foothold as well, because it started to have a more, I want to say this carefully, but plausible argument for how it's better than Bitcoin in terms of trying to offer something that seems legitimately different than Bitcoin. It becomes much more enticing to a new investor because there's more of this sort of diversity that they believe that they are trying to decide between. But just from the perspective of early 2014, this is thinking very much from like people who are already in the space of cryptocurrency. Yes, there's like this huge shell game you have to play to try to switch everyone over. But I think the real prize for everyone, Bitcoin included, came from outside investors too. Like actually more people coming into Bitcoin and wanting to bring their economic value to add to the liquidity pools of the different currencies. And so I think, like I said, I think this is what things like Ethereum were able to latch on quite well to, was being able to present itself as a different thing and entice those new investors, because it's like, well, I've heard about Bitcoin, but what about this Ethereum thing?
The digital oil versus digital gold.
Yes, as opposed to Litecoin as the digital silver. Do you have any other thoughts on that? Do you think I'm onto something there?
Yeah, you are. And, just kind of to Daniel's point, like, I feel like there's a lot of altcoiners who are scamming each other.
Yes.
And they get so busy scamming each other, and they end up not really bringing in new retail money anymore.
Yes. In fact, like it really seemed with some of these like DeFi schemes, I got the sense that these were, it was just like, I'm not plugged into the community enough, but it seemed like there's just like these large groups of degens who are playing a poker game, and it's like every new coin is just like a new round of Texas Hold'em where they're all trying to see, it's like, okay, like how can we trick people into the right things so that I can come out on top and get my piece of the pie. more so than actually, because especially with the DeFi, it's especially hard to bring in new people because like as a long-term Bitcoiner who's very well aware of the technicals of Bitcoin and how it works and all of the, finds, wallets and everything. These are all very second nature. As soon as you start talking about like Uniswap and pancake this or, farming this or whatever, it's like all these different things you're supposed to like do. It's kind of funny watching Coinbase ads or, whatever, where it's like, oh, it's so easy for people to get involved with the global economy. And it's like, you just have to engage in this, Byzantine network of, different swapping mechanisms. That's not something that really brings in new people. Those are all people who have been there long enough to learn all of the jargon and all of the techniques and try to just sort of scam one another.
Yeah, and then they try to create what they call new metas. So a meta is like DeFi or NFTs. Like they're trying to create new games of musical chairs.
Yes. So the bursting of the bubble. The more that altcoiners are asked for valid self-justifications and the more they are asked how their new coin will achieve liquidity, the less effective their arguments will become, the less hype they will be able to generate, and the less that people will buy them. To defeat the altcoin movement, keep warning newbies against them and insist upon relevant arguments every time an altcoiner tries to change the subject. The irrationality that props up the prices of altcoins cannot continue indefinitely. As soon as enough investors learn to think far enough ahead to wonder who the sucker is, the prices of the altcoins will begin to drop inexorably. We can make this happen sooner than later. I would like to see a more concerted effort within the Bitcoin movement to demand valid answers and to denounce as charlatans those who cannot give them. I don't think it's right to let the altcoin bubble continue without trying to stop it. Altcoins will cause a lot of people to lose money and for a lot of people to make money who are not adding value. Many who are already invested will lose, but I would prefer at least that there will be no more. Although I cannot be certain, and I am, like everyone, prone to wishful thinking, I think that there is some indication that the altcoin movement is playing itself out. It is no longer possible to generate any interest in a straight Bitcoin clone like Litecoin. It is now necessary to add either a lot of extra features, as is the case with Mastercoin and Ethereum, or simply to act outrageous, as with Dogecoin. Furthermore, it is ridiculously easy to create altcoins now. CoinGen is a service that automatically creates altcoins to any specification, and which amusingly only accepts payment in Bitcoin. It was apparently created especially for the purpose of helping to discredit altcoins. And to this, I would just point out is like, yes, as far as, you can't just make a straight Bitcoin clone. That is true, and we don't see that anymore. However, I think this was much too optimistic, and that actually people were then going to come up with, like you said, new metas of what is going on, as to try to create a new and improved way to counter Bitcoin, even when they don't think they're countering Bitcoin. And actually, this is a big problem in the altcoin world, where it's like, we're just like the oil, because they don't realize it's like, okay, well, in order to use this stuff, you still have a coin, and that coin is on a free floating basis in the economy, just like any other currency. And so you are a competing currency. And so they don't want to say they're a currency, but are still beholden to the same competitive landscape. And so they'll say that, oh, we're not competing against Bitcoin, but they naturally are. And then the arguments for it is effectively, well, we just have better features. And that's what they've that's what they moved to after this. We have better features. We have, this one offers more privacy. This one offers smart contracting. This one, lets you use it for paying for an application, etc. All of these things, they trust the features instead of having more liquidity, because and meanwhile they try to pretend that it doesn't compete with Bitcoin on that front. And so with that, all of its marketing is effectively anti-Bitcoin because it's saying, Bitcoin isn't good enough here, so you should use, the altcoin, but it never actually gets at the heart of what you would want for a long-term investment or savings. So here he gets into some of the different coins that were not mentioned in the last article. So first is Dogecoin. Dogecoin is the highest form of satire. It is such a perfect depiction of the real-life insanity that it is being treated seriously. It is unabashedly coasting on image with no substance whatsoever. Dogecoin supporters do not claim to be the silver to Bitcoin's gold or to attempt to make any arguments other than such wow to justify Dogecoin as an investment. They just make jokes and give tips to one another. As I write this, Dogecoin is the fourth largest altcoin between Pierre and Mastercoin. This fact should get altcoin investors thinking, does this mean that other altcoin investors are so stupid that they can't tell the difference between a joke and innovative projects like Mastercoin and Pierrecoin? Or does it mean that there actually is no difference? The more people think this way, the more the concept of an altcoin will be discredited. And it really is fun to watch things like Dogecoin, take on the mind share that it does. It really does show some of it shows what really is sort of just hype, because it really is, there's nothing underneath. That was literally what it was made for, was as a joke. If I remember correctly, the creator was rather anti-Bitcoin. This was supposed to satirize Bitcoin. I do remember people, though, arguing Dogecoin was better in some way because of the fact that you could give tips to one another. Is this idea that the tip economy is going to be what drives global dominance. Mastercoin and Ethereum. The other trend in altcoin creation is to add a lot of bells and whistles and to pretend to be a very advanced product so as to hide the fact that it is at bottom an altcoin. Examples of this trend are ProtoShares, Mastercoin, and Ethereum. All of them are basically altcoins that are also platforms for creating more altcoins. This is insane. Each of them has its own individual problems, but the fundamental problem with all of them is that none of their features are useful unless the underlying altcoin is liquid. Thus, their extra features should not be seen as necessarily granting a competitive edge over Bitcoin. They still have an enormous hurdle to overcome before they could be a viable competitor to Bitcoin. When people say, but Ethereum can do smart contracts, this is actually false. It is only the Ethereum protocol plus liquidity that makes smart contracts possible. If Ethereum were not liquid, it would be impossible to build any real penalties into a contract because it would be impossible to tie a sufficient value into them. Since there is no logical reason to expect Ethereum ever to be liquid, there is no logical reason to expect that many people will be able to create smart contracts with it. And he says, it was pointed out to me that Ethereum is capable of acting as a distributed DNS service. This puts it in the same boat as Namecoin. See the section on Namecoin for another conceivable outcome for Ethereum. So we'll get to that. ProtoShares and Mastercoin are no longer being hyped much, and Ethereum is the big new thing. However, none of them addresses the real issue of being a viable competitor to Bitcoin. Ethereum will therefore soon be forgotten like the rest once it inevitably fails to deliver on its promise. And so this, obviously this was wrong. It was not soon forgotten. Ethereum did manage to get created and launch, and it is number 2 to this day. But as far as being a viable competitor to Bitcoin, it still has not been able to deliver that at all. And as we've alluded to many times, in this, none of the kind of the culture of Ethereum, none of the actual the monetary policy in Ethereum, it has not been geared towards liquidity. It's been geared towards utility. It's been focused more on the smart contracts than creating value that can be traded with the smart contracts. And it's also done so in a way that's highly centralized relative to Bitcoin, which further calls into questions like, if Bitcoin is so special because of its scarcity versus the dollar, the reason that's able to do that is because it's decentralized, and so you know that it's not going to be able to be tampered with. But Ethereum, on the other hand, because they're trying to just maximize utility, we've had cases, and you can go find charts of the Ethereum monetary policy. Just how many ethers are in the world, and it follows no logic whatsoever because they've changed their position many times, and they're willing to do so. Not only are they willing, they're able to do so. And so, it's hard to see how smart contracts on that are legitimately better than just smart contracts of a sort on much more explicitly centralized platforms like Solana.
Or just not on platforms. Just using
yeah. Right. I guess I say that specifically because it's like that's why other things like Solana have been able to rise up and kind of be a serious competitor relative to Ethereum. And then, this will just continue on. People will find, even more efficient ways to engage in their behaviors and not really need any of this at all.
There's also, I was going to say like
continue.
a supply chain thing of that essentially after the early adopters have sold out of the platform, so the VCs, they've liquidated their tokens and they need a new one to be an early investor into a new platform that will disrupt the old one. And so there's always kind of pressure on the supply chain perspective that they are benefiting from what we could call seigniorage to issue the new token, and that they have an incentive to make the old one essentially look bad relative to the new one.
Yes, I guess this is also why we've seen so much VC interest in this, because it much more aligns with kind of late stage fiat VC investing and needing to find the next big winner all the time. So you see that. I also wanted to point out, I guess, in the earlier part of the article, he talks about the irrationality and the way that they are, we just have to continue asking these questions and pointing out these things about liquidity and so on, so that we can see how it doesn't hold up in these, so that others can see it, so that hopefully they put their money with something that actually has the long-term value that they probably should actually want. And we've witnessed within specifically Ethereum and such a total meltdowns over some of these questions before. And so I think that strategy has been very useful. Most recently, the way that you've handled the way that Ripple operates, you've caused a lot of trouble with Ripple by pointing out simple questions about how just their organization operates and how centralized the coin is and so on and so forth. Other things in the past, when Alan Farrington asked a simple question of where does the yield come from, that suddenly opens up just like this simple question just shows just how ridiculous a lot of the sort of DeFi schemes that people were using to prop up these altcoins because of what they allow. Turns out that yield is in some sense only interesting when there's actually some productive yield, as opposed to just shell games of kind of winning money in a poker hand. And then another example was also dealing with us, which was when we asked the question of have you audited the Ethereum chain? And it turns out that no. In fact, Bitcoin had not been as audited as it should have been. But because of the nature of Bitcoin, that was quickly reconciled. But Ethereum was unable to do that. And it just, quickly showed a very strong cultural difference between the two the two worlds of Ethereum versus Bitcoin, and also just shined a light on why one of them economically has been able to actually attract and absorb a lot of liquidity, and one of them has had a lot more struggle kind of fighting for utility because they should have focused on the utility of savings. Do you have anything to add on Ethereum, the auditing? Does the auditor have any comments?
No, I mean, I think that gets into can you build something that's better than Bitcoin on the fundamental monetary aspect of receiving, holding, and sending money, and that maybe, as we've discussed, I think in a prior episode, like maybe there was a plausible argument in 2015, whenever they were designing this, that you could have this account model be better than the UTXO model from a software engineering perspective. And I think that what the attempt at auditing Ethereum supply demonstrated was that the account model actually creates a computational cost to reconciling issuance to balances that is far greater than the UTXO set approach. And, just shows that from just a purely digital ledger technology perspective, that Ethereum's actually worse technology than Bitcoin is.
Yes, we've also seen where the account-based model has made it more difficult to make very secure things like multi-sig, which to me is, one of the simplest smart contracts. It's almost like one of the most fundamental ones. Bitcoin does it wonderfully, and it has, from day one. There's always been improvements, moving it more into, script, and we're seeing the rise of Schnorr signatures and so on. So I think that's something that's going to continue to develop, but it's able to do so in a very battle tested way, whereas battle hardened way, where Ethereum, we've seen a lot of account based contracts go wrong. And that calls into question is like, can you even know that you're going to be able to access your money in the long run because some weird things happen with the contract? And so that also shows that, even if you're making new features, it does come at a risk. There's the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think that kind of sometimes applies here, where it's like, there might be ways to make some improvements, but you should be mindful of the fact that, we're dealing with such a large scale entity here that those changes can have much bigger ramifications than you think. It's sort of a Chesterton's fence type deal as well. So yeah, just the claim that you have better technology and even being able to show off some interesting proof of concepts does not necessarily mean that you are free from very, very high risk changes. And so the slow, more conservative development of Bitcoin in many ways has been more innovative because there have been serious innovations, and they've been able to do so at a generally much, much safer manner. So continuing on, legitimate reasons for altcoins. I don't object to altcoins in themselves. What I object to are the lies. There are legitimate reasons for altcoins, but none of them allow for real money to be made off of them. Altcoins should have little or no market value, but the distributed system as a whole can have value as an experiment or a test of a possible upgrade to Bitcoin. I guess technically speaking, you could say a testnet is an altcoin. Because it technically is. Although even then we've, you mentioned this, I think on the last episode, but, we've moved on in many ways to, Signet and stuff like that. So, which I guess you could say are also sort of altcoins. But once again, they're focused on actually being able to develop things in Bitcoin rather than trying to create some kind of investment platform. If you tell me this altcoin implements some cool new idea, then very well. But if you tell me it's going to be the next big thing and that it's a great investment, you're lying. If you believe it yourself, you're lying to yourself. The only reason that an altcoin should have any value at all is as an extreme speculation on the death of Bitcoin. Although it is impossible for an altcoin to beat Bitcoin on its own merits, it is theoretically possible that the Bitcoin community should destroy Bitcoin through its own foolishness. If that possibility should loom, then altcoins can do a valuable service by going up in value, thus alerting the Bitcoin community to reverse what it is doing. I do want to point out, I agree with this. At the same time, I would point out that as far as going up in value against Bitcoin, this would have to be sustainable growth. So not just, a quick hype cycle. And it would also have to be sustainable growth over Bitcoin. So merely looking at something that's like going up against the dollar, you do always have to look at it priced against Bitcoin to see that it's overtaking Bitcoin. But many things come and go. And so they can, in the short term, they can be higher than Bitcoin. And just because a new thing is launched and Bitcoin is underperforming a hype cycle on some, new thing does not mean that Bitcoin itself is failing. It just means that there's a hype cycle going on in some new degen coin. So instead, we have to look much more long term on this. And I think this would be, you might have some thoughts on like what kind of time frame you would even think about it, but I would say on the time frame of basically years of sustainable growth over Bitcoin. And we specifically saw a problem with, say, the dominance index during the rise of the ICOs, which was a few years after this article. So not until around 2017, 2018 is when you had a lot of these ICOs. And the problem with that is when you looked at dominance index, and there's a great article on the Nakamoto Institute by Jimmy Song about this. I'll link to it in the show notes. The problem with this is if you just launch a bunch of ICOs on Ethereum and then you count the market cap of that against Bitcoin as well, every time someone makes a new one and it's a highly illiquid good, so you can kind of put some prices on it that don't necessarily make any sense, and the market's not really playing with it, so there's not really price discovery. It can make Bitcoin look artificially less dominant than it actually is. And so we saw that. We saw Bitcoin dominance go down considerably on some of these, index metrics. And so people use that in this sense as an argument to say, see, Bitcoin wasn't able to supply what the market demanded, therefore it's kind of losing, and Bitcoin is the past, Ethereum, or whatever thing, this is the future. But because of those problems with the actual liquidity, it could be difficult. And actually, if you took the ICOs out of the dominance index, obviously the Bitcoin dominance was still much higher. And then, despite all of that, we have millions of these things out there now, and Bitcoin's dominance index has been continually rising for the past quite a bit of time. And so even with all of that competition, Bitcoin still kept trudging along and doing what it needed to do and accruing real value based on real savings, based on a real understanding of its fundamentals and what those fundamentals offer. And so I do think that, if altcoins were gaining into a serious liquidity advantage over many years, that would probably raise some questions about Bitcoin. But I would argue that is not something that we have actually seen, despite people wanting to make it seem that way.
Yep, I agree.
So moving on to the last one of Namecoin. So, and Namecoin was I think it'll mention it was a sort of distributed DNS system, and Ethereum kind of offers the same thing. A key thing here, and I should have mentioned this with Dogecoin at the time, Dogecoin, when this article was written, was literally the number 6 altcoin, and Namecoin at the time was number 9. So both of these, Dogecoin, kind of had a comeback because of Elon Musk. Namecoin has basically completely disappeared. I don't remember the last time I've seen anyone talking about it other than in a historical sense. But at the time, these actually were among the top coins. And so that's why they were being focused on here. So Namecoin. Namecoin is unique among altcoins as far as I know in that it provides a valuable service directly to users that does not depend on the value of the underlying coin. It is not simply an experiment that might be viable one day if it were incorporated into the Bitcoin protocol, although it would be more useful if it could at least be made compatible with Bitcoin in some way. Namecoin is a system that includes both an altcoin and a distributed name registration service. Namecoin is designed so that namecoins must be spent in order to register a name on its blockchain. This is a design flaw because the extra currency is extra baggage. It would have been better to design Namecoin to work directly with Bitcoin instead, but since a distributed DNS service is inherently useful, it is possible that Namecoin could succeed anyway. In a future world in which Namecoin has gone mainstream, Namecoins would have to have some value, even if they did not become the dominant currency. In that case, however, Namecoins would not be a currency at all, but simply a token used to interact with the Namecoin system. They will survive as a parasite that detracts from the overall value of the Namecoin system. If a means could be designed to make Namecoin work with Bitcoin payments, for example, by designing a protocol that provably ties a Namecoin payment to a Bitcoin payment that goes to the Namecoin miner, then Namecoin the currency would become a nearly worthless token more rapidly, and the Namecoin system would be greatly improved. And I kind of disagree that I think that the service kind of, does depend on the value of the coin, just like smart contracts and Ethereum requires the liquidity. So I don't know if I agree with that first point. I also, when we say distributed DNS is sort of inherently useful, you could say that that's something that is can be seen as useful outside the context of any kind of blockchain thing. But even that, I think there's probably a lot of debate to be had about, what would a proper DNS architecture actually look like? And funny enough, I think, Nostr might be a path for something more interesting, but I'm not gonna put my money down on that necessarily. But that being said, I think there are some very important points in this one that should be reiterated, which is, when he's saying, there being a design flaw having another currency because the extra currency is extra baggage. This came up later in the ICOs and Altcoins, and we're going to talk more about Altcoins later, so maybe this is actually better for that, but I'll mention it here anyway, which is, if you have some kind of cool app you want to do, it's not good to also decide, and by the way, I'm also going to become the Federal Reserve. It's like you should focus on the actual app itself and delivering it. And I think by putting it on a blockchain, it allowed a belief in a decentralization theater that made you think you're doing something that can't happen outside of a blockchain. And it just creates this rationalization for needing to have this extra currency. And it really is a drag on the system because you can't focus on like the core value creation that you're doing, of some application that you believe is useful for people. You are instead having to focus on a currency, and you are beholden to the value of that currency on the market. Whereas, grocery stores, just as an example, the price goes up and, people might not be able to get as many eggs as they want to because they killed off a ton of chickens. But the grocery stores are still open and people still have to go use the grocery stores. If the grocery stores suddenly started creating their own token, it would be kind of a nightmare to have to go to the grocery store, and they would be much more beholden to the market in ways beyond their core competency. So I think that's Namecoin kind of shows that in this early sense. It's like when you're attaching a money, you're taking away from the actual thing you're trying to do, and you're not actually decentralized. So you're not actually. You might also be making some fundamental architectural, decision flaws when you're coming up with this.
Yeah, I haven't used Namecoin recently.
I think I may have played with it way back, just very briefly. And someone else. I never even touched name coins, but I remember being with friends and seeing like how it works with the namespace. There was I think it was one name which went through so many iterations that it's now, I think it's basically stacks. Is kind of all from that same world. And so that was the thing. I know I had a one name account, but so I knew a little bit about how the data storage worked and everything. But it quickly ran away or went away. And I've not even thought about that in maybe a decade now. So concluding, altcoins are not viable because they cannot reproduce that which gives Bitcoin an overwhelming competitive edge, its market cap. It is unethical to create an altcoin with the purpose of making money off of it for this reason. They should not be taken seriously. The way to defeat them is to keep demanding of the altcoin promoters that they spell out why their altcoin makes sense as an investment. The more that this demand is made, the worse altcoins will look. This point needs to be made in a variety of ways again and again. This article and the few others that have been written are not enough. It needs to be restated in as many different ways as possible until the altcoin movement is over. Disclosure: the author owns Bitcoins but has never owned altcoins due to the fact that they are unsustainable. If he thought altcoins were sustainable, he would buy them rather than explain very carefully why they are unsustainable. He did try to mine Dogecoin for a few hours once, but was not wowed. And I fundamentally agree. I think it needs to be restated in many ways as possible. I think this article was fantastic at the time. I think going into now 10 years later, there have been so many developments in the altcoin world. I've joked for a long time that altcoins, the development of altcoins, is many ways like a development of marketing strategies. They went from the announcement threads on Bitcoin Talk to developing, a nice little bootstrap website to, by the time you get to Ethereum, you are getting very, very highly produced, beautiful websites that have a lot more marketing emphasis behind it. A lot of these, when they launch, they come with very large marketing teams that take their jobs very seriously, because there's a lot of money to be made off of the people they're trying to get the money from. And so there's been a lot of development in terms of the arguments that they've had to make, and this is an ongoing thing. And I think as far as the altcoins that were just kind of copies, we've seen them all come and go, and we've seen other ones that tried to be something different also come and go. Things like Polkadot, I don't think that's really around anymore, but at the time that was a big one. And this is something that does need to be restated. So, in many ways, this article has key points that I think could be restated many times over in the present day in different ways, focused on more specific problems. And so, if anything, I perhaps regret not taking up that even more seriously than previously. So anyway, Pierre, did you have anything else?
Oh, no, I just thought it was funny that Barry Silbert recently announced that he would have more Bitcoin today if he had not gotten so involved in altcoins. So let that be a cautionary tale for all.
Yes, and he was one of the bigger beneficiaries of the altcoin market. So it's an especially large lesson. So go out there and learn more about what makes Bitcoin great and why it stands out, and help others understand. Thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the SNI archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.